We're back with an extended conversation to really think, how do we go then from the Middle Ages and the fantasy of the Middle Ages to Tolkien and the Rings of Power on Amazon Prime? As a medievalist and curator, Larissa and I have spoken a lot about the Middle Ages, from costume to architecture and more. And so, Larissa, what are those medieval elements that we're already seeing so clearly in the Rings of Power?
I think this is a really interesting question because there's not actually very much medieval there, right? It's mostly indebted to the history of medieval fantasy, and it sort of is a, a chicken or egg situation, sort of which came first. And Tolkien is always talked about as the father of modern fantasy, but he is so indebted to his scholarship as a medievalist, but also to so many centuries of medievalism. And so the things that read very medieval to me are the costumes, the idea that everyone rides horses, medieval technology is still very much a part of this world. There are swords, there are all of the things we expect, I think, from a world that feels medieval enough, without actually referencing all that much medieval. And of course, there are still medieval politics. There's still the idea of monarchy, of feudalism. And I think those are really interesting concepts, which kind of sit in the background and aren't really talked about so much by the characters, but which really feel of a part of the history of medieval fantasy.
I agree. I'm glad that you've drawn that clear distinction between the medieval and the medievalism that the world is so indebted to. I wonder, John, then, from your perspective in thinking about the books and the way the world is being constructed as a space that preserves its own histories and traditions, what are the stepping stones between the distant past and the world of Rings of Power that we're seeing on our screens?
I think there is nothing quite so magical, and I think Larissa has shown this at the Getty, of seeing like fantasy and the book. We see, the opening of every Disney film, is a cartoon book opening. It is the Once Upon a Time. So in terms of like for the fantasy, having to go a little bit further back in terms of kind of world writing history methods, we see elements of stone tablet or clay tablet or some sort of very firm writing surface in these films. But then mainly in the last two episodes, you see elements of scroll, whether it is a sort of paper material or more like animal skin. I kept, for what they've created for the show, I was like pausing when they were in the Hall of Records to kind of look and be like, oh, what do you think they're using to write this on? And so you see these different traditions coming out, because then the Harfoots have, this big kind of history storybook with the star charts and things in it, and it's in the codex form. It's not a scroll. So in sort of that history and chronology, I hate to say like a more advanced book form, but a very different book form than a scroll. And then our historical traditions, kind of the codex developed out of the scroll and Western tradition. So just seeing how like these two different forms are playing off of each other is really interesting.
And even with the Harfoots, as you mentioned, we had this interesting dialogue where Poppy refers to Nori and says that her skin will be turned into the pages of the book if she's attempting to steal the codex and is caught. So they're clearly aware of skin, parchment, use, which I thought was a really subtle point. But then looking at the manuscript itself, I thought, well, it doesn't look like skin. Some of it looks much more paper. So even if there's those nods that maybe don't look as authentic, I found myself also in the Hall of Lore and Records looking at the image on the wall of Elrond and Elros and thinking, is that a painting? Is it a tapestry? I can see a kind of canvas weave, but it doesn't look quite like either. But there's a nod at least to these greater visual traditions. And then Diva, in these world making, we've mentioned so many places as we're sailing into Numenor. What are the other art historical precedents that get us from the past to Tolkien and the Rings of Power?
There's so many, as we've all talked about, but I think what's really interesting is, of course, there's not like a hard stop between the medieval and the early modern period, which is like 1400 to 1700. So in the early modern period, they're constantly calling back to things that are medieval and calling back to the ancient Roman world. So I think there's a lot of blurring for me. It's hard to exactly pin down what's medieval and what's Roman, what's not. One thing I thought was interesting was Gil-galad's the kind of laurels that he wears, and I was thinking about those and how you also see those in the Renaissance, right, with like portraits of people who want to appear like referencing classical poetry and classical Roman, that world. So I thought that was really interesting to have him in particular, it's like the king, have that kind of mark of Renaissance, perhaps erudition or nobility, that's also taken from the classical world. So that's just sort of one example of the kind of slippage of, I can't identify exactly when Laurel's stop and start, for example.
It isn't, because when those first promo images came out, I myself was thinking, are they trying to suggest a classical age that predates the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings films that we know so well? Or is it, as you mentioned, this sort of reference to Renaissance material? I think there's so much of that tension, as you say, and even in your Numenor background, we have that wonderful shift in the architecture near the tower at left, where we have the pointed arches, which might remind us more of the world of elves, that are being plastered over or built entirely over with marble or new facing in a rounded style. So the showrunners and the designers entirely, it seems, are committed to this world that has so much more than just the surface. And I guess if we think about those illustration traditions that Larissa was mentioning, Sarah, with your work in the 19th century, you've already reminded us of Cole and of Turner. How do we then get from your moment to the Rings of Power? What are you seeing evoked from those earlier centuries?
I mean, I would echo what everyone has said so far, and also just the idea that, I think it's important to put out there maybe that, we all recognize that this is a fantasy world, that it's not our real history. And so it's fun for us to note these traditions and how they wend their way, how the production teams are wending these different references together. But it's not like we're looking at it and saying, oh, that's not authentically Babylonian, so therefore it's wrong for this fantasy setting. It's just cool to see these things coming in. But one thing that came up, I mean, Brian, you brought up the tapestry in the Hall of Lore, and that kind of reminding me back to like the chamber with the shards of Narsil in the Fellowship of the Ring, in the Peter Jackson movie. And it sort of prompted a thought experiment on Twitter that I had mulling over, and that I do think kind of ties us into the 19th century as well, is a question of, is there a sort of illusionistic perspective in Arda? Is that a tradition? I mean, clearly there is some privileging of, and sorry, this is getting into, art technique sort of weeds here, but clearly there is some privileging of illusionism. We get that, the illusion of perspectival depth, of representational depth. We get that in that tapestry. So yeah, I was kind of thinking through with another art historian on Twitter, sort of like, what if there is illusionistic perspective in Arda, sort of who is responsible for it, or who innovated it? And I sort of put out there, I would see it as more of a late Second Age or early Third Age kind of innovation, possibly from the dwarves, possibly from humans, maybe a productive collaboration between them. But that's something that is very evident in the style of 19th century illustrations. There is still this emphasis on kind of illusionism or naturalism, even in a lot of the fantastical illustrations. And that's also something you see in Tolkien's own illustrations. So particularly his illustrations for The Hobbit, where there a lot of times, like the famous, I mean, I have the cover of Maker right here, the famous like Bilbo coming to the Raft Huts, where it's got this kind of decorative frame that is very reminiscent of 19th century medievalizing books. But there's also this recourse to perspective and representational depth, and that merging of the two, I feel is very much in it's a touchstone of Tolkien's style of illustration. So I like that it makes its way into the show as well.
And I like that you've reminded all of those listening that we're not looking to totally fact check this world as something real, or with any sort of sense of nationalism or identity from any real past. It is really an exciting thought experiment that all art historians engage in some way when we see anything in visual media, right? I think we're trying to see what are the reference points and the decisions that are being made, because they do communicate powerful messages. And then I wonder, Sophia, if bringing it to the present with all of the great illustration traditions of the Tolkien works themselves, whether with Alan Lee or John Howe, and then Peter Jackson, whose name we've mentioned a few times. How are you seeing these other visual traditions being drawn upon or referenced in the Rings of Power?
Certainly, like John Howe, for example, I mean, his details of armor illustrations come into the Rings of Power. I mean, they were in Lord of the Rings, now in Rings of Power. So his kind of ability, his illustrations themselves of like the locations of the castles and the costumes and persons of that period coming in, and we see that. I want to go back to what we were talking about with Numenor in terms of Renaissance. So one of my area is the Renaissance area, and also 17th century. And so in even a little bit more of the 18th, so it's really Venetian. In the Numenorian kind of world building there, we see, not only like the Venetian aspect of it, but really it's, for me, it's a more Guardi aspect of it, like where we were at the ports. So it's a lot of like the kind of almost gondola-like boats that were going by, but as well as like the workers there, the portsmiths, people pulling in like all the supplies and putting it in the harbor and such. So I think there's a lot of those traditions coming in, and of course John Howe and Alan Lee. I mean, they know art history. They look at all these works of art and draw from them for their own illustrations. I read somewhere that when Peter Jackson was working on Gondorf's costuming and advising for that, he basically took John Howe's illustration of Gondorf and said, okay, no, it needs to look like this. If it doesn't look like this, he's not Gondorf.
I think that's right. And that's the point that so many of us have hinted at, that there's already so many expectations going into this about what Middle-earth looks like because of all of these precedents, most specifically those tied to the world and the lore of Tolkien, as we've seen for decades now, but also these broader art historical precedents that take us back centuries, even to the deep and ancient past. So this has been thrilling to have a thought experiment about the world of Tolkien and the making of Middle-earth and the Rings of Power. And I look forward to developing this conversation as we proceed further into Middle-earth. Thank you all, and Namaste.